Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to Thursday, even more beautiful weather than last week. Zube lecture series. And my name is Frank Sliegers, Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture. This lecture series has been possible through endowment of Irv and his wife, Margaret Zube. And thank you. We're also very thankful for future support from alumni to support our excellent lecture series that brings world-class presenters, academians, practitioners like today here on Zoom, hopefully soon even in person to our campus. So let me make some announcement until Jack Ahern is take over as a host of today. So we're having maybe one thing importantly next week we're having student presentations. That's also important for the students who are actually participating in this new class. Pick and join our great work of our graduate and undergraduate students. And that's my first number. Next Zube lecture is also then because we're having presentations next week. That again, you all should be invited to come. We share the links to it. And in 2 weeks we have Sarah in Houston. So in 2 weeks, not next week. Please stay tuned. And looking forward today having again an engaging discussion and presentation. So I will hand it over to Jack Ahern. Jack, yeah.
Yes, thank you, Frank. Welcome everyone. It's my real pleasure and honor to welcome Brice Maryman this afternoon. Interesting anniversary. Brice is from Seattle. Seattle was one of the early hotspots in the US for COVID. And when Brice was thinking about coming here, well, not thinking, he was planning to come here. He had his plane ticket. And the day before he was going to come, we got on the phone and we decided to cancel it. And it seemed like a big decision at the time. Now it seems like, yeah, of course, that's what you do. So I'm glad that we could get him back. When we rescheduled this, we thought we would be able to have him in person, but unfortunately not yet. So, but I think you're in for a very interesting talk this afternoon. Brice is a landscape architect. He's a principal at MIG in Seattle. I believe Brice is one of the early fellows of the Landscape Architecture Foundation, where he was given the opportunity to focus on an important issue, and he took on the issue of homelessness and what landscape architects can do to address that issue. So it's extremely timely work. There's a nice article about Brice from Landscape Architecture magazine. I believe Nathan distributed that to you all. I would encourage you to look at that if you haven't seen it yet. But basically, Brice thinks like a landscape architect and thinks like, what, okay, we have a big issue of housing insecurity. I know he doesn't like to call it homelessness all the time. And in Seattle, where he's from, is one of the real hotspots of this issue in the country. So he's right in his backyard, and he did some extremely interesting and important work on trying to understand the people who were experiencing housing insecurity, and also thinking about innovative strategies and practices to find ways to build solutions to terribly important problem. But Brice is a real hero in my book because he's putting his skills and energy towards this really important work. And I just learned from him a few minutes ago that he's writing a book on this, which should be a very important contribution to the field. And we should all look forward to that. So it's my pleasure now to welcome Brice Maryman from Seattle.
Great, thank you. Nathan, I think you need to enable screen sharing for me here.
You are a co-host, unless, oh, sorry, yeah, my apologies. I forgot you dropped out and came back. Let me make you a co-host to give you more abilities. And you should be able to share now.
Great. All right. Well, thank you everyone for the invitation first and for the kind words, Frank and Jack, and also thanks for the help, Nathan and Stacy on the back end in getting things prepared today. I'm not seeing anyone raising their hand, so hopefully my screen is sharing at this point. I want to start today and just acknowledge real quickly that I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Coast Salish, and that includes specifically the Duwamish, Suquamish, Stillaguamish, and Muckleshoot tribes who've stewarded the lands that I'm living on since time immemorial. And that's a particularly important insight and recognition, as you'll see later on in the conversation today. So a little bit about MIG. I know that we don't practice so much on the East Coast, but we have about 15 offices up and down the West Coast, including Denver and Texas. And the largest portion of our work is within landscape architecture, urban design, that sort of thing. The rough outline of the conversation today is going to be oriented towards the students, I think, in thinking about how we can mix this alchemy of career and design and professional practice, particularly the private consultant model, and advocacy, and how we can bridge those two things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a professional project that was very unsatisfying, how that spun into some passion projects and volunteer projects, and how that ultimately came back to a professional project that we're working on today. And along the way, we're going to learn a lot and dive deep into issues of homelessness, both at a national level and kind of some of the underlying causes, and bring us up to speed on a primer there. So before January of 2016, I had never explored homelessness. It was something that was in the background of my consciousness in terms of my experience of the city. And that all changed on the night of January 26th, 2016, when 3 boys, aged 17, 16, and the youngest was just 13, went into what was a 400-person homeless encampment underneath Interstate 5 and shot 5 people, killing 2 of them. And this was such a kind of egregious crime in the psyche of the city that prides itself on being very progressive, prides itself on being very prosperous. The mayor was supposed to actually talk about homelessness that night and never did because of this shooting. It was really an incident that shook the city. And over the next coming months, the entire city got to know and understand this landscape that is known as the jungle. And the people who live there, we got to hear about their stories. And our office actually got invited into that conversation in a very explicit way when the mayor's office reached out to us and said, how do we make this space underneath I-5 something more interesting, something more dramatic, something that is a place that is welcoming for people? Because it was scary, it was intimidating, it was not comforting. And so we pitched all these different ideas. These are just a selection of them, including housing under that space that was a more formalized housing than what was there now. And I mentioned that I was going to start off with an unfulfilling project. It's unfulfilling, this project, because they ended up doing none of these things. What ultimately happened was that in January of 2017, they decided to move people out of the jungle, and the city kind of made some vague promises of, oh, you can go in one of these 2 spots. That lasted for maybe a month and a half. And then what has happened since then in the interceding 3-4 years is that the issue of homelessness has just, people have been moved from place to place without a formal place to call home, a spot where they can land. And it has become more and more atomized and more impactful to different neighborhoods within the city. So that a landscape scene like this, heading into downtown Seattle, with the encampment there in the front foreground, is still not uncommon. And it might be there for 3 or 4 months before the city decides to spend money in moving them around. And the city, one estimate puts it that the city is spending upwards of $10 million every year, sweeping people, cleaning up those campsites, restoring it, and moving them around again. And so, this question really struck me as one, that this was a spatial question, and that there might be a value add that the landscape architecture community contribute. But personally, it really raised a lot of questions, sort of ethically. What responsibility do we have? From a democratic perspective, what's the role of public space, especially when people don't have any other choice except to live in public space? And professionally, our license says that what we're supposed to do is protect the public's health, safety, and welfare. And what was happening in terms of homelessness seemed to be doing none of those things. It wasn't making people safer, it wasn't promoting welfare, and it certainly wasn't promoting health. So Jack mentioned that I was fortunate enough to receive one of the inaugural fellowships through the Landscape Architecture Foundation, their Innovation and Leadership Fellowship, which I recommend if you have the opportunity, apply. It's a wonderful program. And through that, I was able to host a podcast called Homeland Lab. And these gracious 30 some odd people were kind enough to speak with me and share their experience, their perspective on homelessness. And for me, it was a real opportunity to educate myself. I spoke with advocates, I spoke with people who had been homeless, people who were finding housing solutions, people who were politicians, researchers, what have you. And their insights really informed the rest of this conversation. So I just want to acknowledge them and thank them for what they shared. So I'm going to step back and kind of ground us in what the understanding of the current homeless landscape is. So every year in America, there are about 550,000 people who are experiencing homelessness. And the way that that is counted is one night every year, usually in January, volunteers go out and they count the number of people who are in shelters, and these are the blue and light blue dots, tally those folks up. They also count the people who are called unsheltered, and those are people who are sleeping outdoors, sleeping in tents, sleeping in RVs, and that percentage of unsheltered homeless are probably the ones who are having the biggest impact on our public landscapes. That's happening every single year. Oh, and that population of unsheltered homeless folks is about 150,000 each year. Now, where are those people located? I wanted to present this chart, which describes where people in the 10 biggest cities in terms of populations of homelessness are located across the US. And you can see it's primarily a coastal phenomenon. And what's interesting to look at is, New York, Los Angeles, they're roughly the same population of homeless folks. But I want you to look at Philadelphia, because this is that total population of both people experiencing homelessness who are sheltered and unsheltered. So in a city that has a really robust shelter system like New York, you're going to see less of an impact on our public landscapes. But when we look at the next slide, which describes the unsheltered homeless population, you can see that several West Coast cities are having unsheltered homeless populations that are rivaling the number of total people in Philadelphia who are experiencing homelessness. So I think Jack alluded to it in our earlier conversation. This is really an acute problem that's felt across the United States, but perhaps the West Coast is really feeling the brunt of it. And I think that it's probably only going to get worse, unfortunately, for the rest of the country. So I want to talk a little bit about the myths that we tell ourselves around homelessness. One of those myths is that, somehow these people are other from us. Maybe they have an addiction issue, maybe they have mental health, maybe they're emerging from a domestic violence situation. There's some other trauma that is driving them into homelessness. Therefore, they are not us. They're somehow othered and different. What's interesting is that the data is telling us a different story. This is a set of data and benchmarks that the Department of Commerce here put together in Washington State, looking at the period from 2005 to 2015. And some of the data sets are incomplete, but they were asked by our legislature, why are we seeing so much homelessness happening? And so they looked at the usual suspects. They looked at alcohol use. You can see that it's a relatively straight line, so no correlation to a spike in homelessness. Opioid use, similar phenomenon. Illicit drug use generally, same idea. Family structure, was it teen mother birth rates that were driving an increase in homelessness? Not so much, nor divorce rates. Domestic violence over this period actually dipped down. That's actually since gone up for other reasons, but it's dipped down here. Percent of children in married couple households, so family structure, again, not a correlated factor. Education, bachelor's degrees, and high school attainment. And again, one of the really interesting things is employment is a counter indicator. As employment was going up, homelessness was also rising. You might expect the opposite to happen, but it was actually, as employment, as the economy was booming, so was homelessness. So that causes people to ask, okay, so what's that proximate cause of homelessness? What is driving people out into the street? And we talked about those different traumas that people might be experiencing, but the underlying trauma that every single person, no matter what their individualized story, is facing is a lack of affordable housing. And this is not just the findings of the Washington State Department of Commerce, it's findings by a number of researchers time and time again in different housing markets. One of the primary drivers is the dynamics of the rental housing market. So what happens is, as vacancy rates within a given metropolitan area dip below the 5% threshold, it starts to push demand up. And as demand starts to get pushed up, the housing prices start to get pushed up. So all of a sudden, landlords can increase their rents, and that increase in rent, without a commensurate raise in minimum wage or other factors, it pushes people out into the street. In fact, one study in Los Angeles said that for every $100 increase, there was a 6 to 30% increase in homelessness. So very specifically tied to economics. Okay, so this is a landscape architecture lecture. What does this have to do with landscape architecture? There's some really profound ways that it actually ties in with our practice. And I'm gonna turn the microphone over here to Richard Rothstein, who wrote the incredible book, The Color of Law. Hopefully you've had a chance to be exposed to it and read it during your training. If not, I highly recommend you pick it up. I was fortunate enough to talk with Richard through the podcast, and one name leapt off the page when I was talking to him, and I want you all to hear what Richard said to me.
Hoover established the Committee on Zoning. Members of this committee, many of them, including Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., were outspoken segregationists and proclaimed that the reason that they were promoting zoning was to prevent racial mixing, to prevent the integration of communities.
So in the 1920s, 1930s, as zoning was rolling out across the American landscape, it was deliberately to prevent integration, and deliberately the result of that was that Black families were not able to build wealth in the same way that white families were. But there were other ways that landscape architects played a role in this sort of intergenerational wealth transfer. let's look at the interstate highway system, which decimated downtowns in Atlanta, in Chicago, in Cincinnati, where the remnants of lower income, usually Black neighborhoods are still there in the Zillow maps today. Or we can look here out in the American West. This is the Columbia River in eastern Washington, and Celilo Falls is the name of this set of whitewater. It's kind of in the mid-ground there. For some 6,000, 8,000 years, this was the ancestral fishing land for salmon coming up the Columbia River. The town of Celilo, these falls were the place where tribes would gather along the Columbia Plateau and harvest and bring in food for their families. And that was all drowned when the Dales Dam went in. Or at the beginning of our profession with Seneca Village on the land that is now Central Park. And these are just but a few examples, but it reveals how landscape architecture, because we're a service profession, we reflect the desires of the society that we work in, was complicit in this wealth transfer. And it should surprise us then very little that the homeless population is vastly overrepresented in people of color in terms of Black, American Indian, Hawaiians, compared to the general population, right? So these things that happened generations ago are still being felt today. And as we come to the built environment, how do we greet them in our contemporary practice? Often it's with spaces like this that are hostile, that are defensive, that are uninviting, that are deliberately made to provide discomfort. And even not only in the physical realm, but even well-intentioned climate-friendly policies like, hey, you should, if you're riding a bike, which we want you to do, you need to have a helmet. Those enforcement mechanisms also turn out to be problematic. So nearly half of Seattle's helmet citations are going to homeless people. And we're actually leading an effort right now to repeal the helmet law in order to make that not a crime. So instead of defunding the police, we are decriminalizing the behavior. Now, what we should be doing, right, is to have more housing. And for quite a while, for a number of decades, the United States was building quite a bit of public housing, particularly following the World War II. That has not kept up with population growth. So we're not seeing the adequate supply of housing keeping pace with population, forcing more people out onto the street. And in fact, this has picked up over the last 40 years or so, from the late 70s, early 80s, when the public housing construction fund was really decimated. And we're creating much fewer units with the limited amount of public investment than we were in the past. And what this means, this sort of 40-year-long feedback cycle that we're in, means that now people have no place to go. People are not finding a place that is that low income, low price point place to live. At the same time, we haven't invested in social services. So the intertwined fates of homelessness and public space are about this cycle, where we cut back on social service and public housing. That leads to increased homelessness, which leads to increased negative impacts on public spaces, which declines our civic trust, our bonds of next to one another, which means a reduced willingness to invest in public infrastructure, which then means that we aren't going to spend on public parks and public spaces. It's a vicious cycle that just continues unless we deliberately decide to break it. And that's where the hope lies, because I think that we can design better policies and systems and environments. And that starts with recognizing that investments in social service and housing start that virtuous cycle of decreased homelessness, which means fewer negative impacts on public spaces, which means increased civic trust, which means an increased willingness to invest in public infrastructure, which means more money to create parks, to create libraries, to create spaces that bind us together. So I want to start talking about some specific examples of communities that have had that insight and acted on it. And I'm going to start with the small agricultural community of Walla Walla, which is in Eastern Washington. It's about 30,000 people. Eastern Washington, in our state sort of political geography, Western Washington, where Seattle is blue. Eastern Washington, where Walla Walla is red in terms of its political dynamics. Walla Walla itself, it has Whitman College, so it's kind of a purple in between community. What's interesting about Walla Walla is it's primarily sort of, think of it as like Napa for the West or for Washington State. It's a bit of a wine community. It attracts people from Portland and Seattle and Spokane and Boise, kind of a regional hub for the viticulture industry. And what they were seeing happen is that right around 2010, they were starting to see impacts of homelessness turn up in their parks, specifically in this gazebo that's the image on the left there. And they didn't know what to do. It's not a community with a huge human services population. It realized that its public image was really important for tourism and for the economic underpinning of the community. At the same time, they had a smart city attorney who was looking over at Boise, Idaho, at what was going on there. And what was happening there was a legal decision working its way through the courts, going up from the local courts up to the federal courts and ultimately to the Supreme Court, that asked whether or not it was legal to kick someone out of public space for performing what they call life-sustaining activities, sleeping, eating, sitting. Could they move someone out of public space for that? And what the Supreme Court ultimately decided at the end of 2019 was that it is unconstitutional to kick someone out of public space simply for doing life-sustaining activities. That doing so constituted cruel and unusual punishment, which is barred by the 14th Amendment. So this lawyer at the city of Walla Walla is like, okay, we can't kick people out of parks. I know that lots of other cities are doing that. We can't do that. We need to find another way, another path forward. So the city and some hardy volunteers who are willing to iterate and take a chance and design a different system came together and said, well, what if we tried this? And they built those bonds of trust that allowed them to try, but not just try, but to try and fail. And that takes us to Camp Chaos. This was the first thing they tried. In 2016, 2017, they set aside a little parcel of land next to the baseball stadium in one of their public parks as a sanctioned encampment, essentially. And it did not work. Everyone will admit that. It did not work. One of the things that they learned, though, was that they needed to have, it couldn't be a self-managed camp. They needed to have some sort of imprimatur of society on it. They needed to figure out the relationship of police to this encampment. And so they iterated over that summer and came up with this, which is the sleeping center. And this was borrowing ideas from various places, primarily from Eugene, Oregon, where they have these miniature huts, and I'll explain a little bit more about the huts in a bit. And they set aside some public land. In this case, it's the back of their maintenance shops. And you can see the public toilets there. Those bins are not trash bins. They are actually for people's belongings. People can store them in those. And people who come there are able to sleep in a safe spot. They're able to have some sort of imprimatur of sort of rules and lines that can't be crossed. And it gives them a safe place to be that is not out in the public parks. So it was a win from the business community's perspective. It was a win from the client's perspective. And it was a win from sort of city government perspective. One of the things that they solved at the sleep center was how they relate to the police department. So instead of, if someone acts up and is pushing boundaries within the sleep center, they can get kicked out for a period of time. But instead of, let's say someone punches someone else, Often that just gets handled by them being asked to leave the facilities for the night. The next day, they go in front of not a judge, but in front of the assistant city manager, who decides, you know, okay, are you going to be kicked out for 3 days, or do you need to be kicked out for a week? They aren't getting the judicial system and the criminal justice system involved. They're keeping the load light and also not getting people sucked into having a record, having to pay fines that they can't pay, et cetera, et cetera. So the way that Walla Walla's system works is it really acts as a day center. It's a sleeping center, where people cannot be during the day. They have to go find something else to do during the day. But during the night, it's a place where they can shower, they can meet others, they can work on filling paperwork that gets them benefits. It's a place where they can get clean, they can store their stuff, they can be safe. Now, over that 2-year period, it proved such a success that they had more demand than they had available spots. And so they started looking for another place to land. And thank goodness for innovative policymakers and politicians who saw the model had been proved and said, okay, well, let's figure out how to expand this. And they actually did a trade, a land swap from some other city-owned land to this parcel of industrial zone land and said, let's make this work. So a much bigger parcel of land. They got some donated double wide trailers that can serve as sort of a community hub. They were able to, you can see there on the right in the image, they got a donated shower facility. They're really able to spread out as well so that people were not right on top of each other. And it's becoming a space that they haven't put the community garden in yet, but they're planning on putting a community garden in right in the middle of there that anyone can come to. It's a low barrier. It's a place to sleep, a place to stay for the members of that Walla Walla homeless community. And those huts are nothing fancy. They are very easy to build, a couple $1,000s a pop, 6 foot by 10 foot, no insulation, no heating, no electricity. They are as basic a shelter as you can find. But it's triage. It's getting people safe. It's getting them stable so that they can have a place to work for from there. And it affords for those residents low barrier, safety, warmth, dryness, durability, personal connections, and that structure and rule of law, and some of the amenities that have already been spoken about. Now, is this perfect? No, it is not. What we need to do, and what any human service provider will tell you, is the way to end homelessness is to get people in permanent supportive housing. But what this does is it raises the floor on the conversation. Instead of saying that we're going to accept people willy-nilly within our public spaces in unsafe places by the edges of freeways, that sort of thing, we're going to raise the floor so that at a bare minimum, people have a safe place to sleep. And I want to turn it over here to Chuck, who is one of the volunteers at the Alliance, and just hear him reflect on the experience that they had.
The solution is not to just be the meanest place around so that hopefully they won't come here. Because there are plenty of mean places, mean streets, anywhere. But we decided that we would see if we couldn't give them a place to go. And once we did that, it changed the community. It changed downtown dramatically. It changed the lives of the folks that are here. When you're on the street, it's street rules. But when you're here, it's camp rules. And you have to be civil to other people. You have to take care of your hut. You have to take care of the grounds. You have to do other things. But once we gave people a place to go and they had a good night's sleep, I don't know about you, but I'm a whole lot better person if I have a good night's sleep. So I think it has made a difference.
So Chuck's insight and several other models that I looked at, like what Walla Walla was doing, brought me back to the jungle. and thinking about how that impact of homelessness had sort of metastasized across the public landscape of the city of Seattle. And it got me thinking specifically about the neighborhood that I live in, which is really has quite a wealth of open spaces and of public lands. In fact, in this image, it has upwards of 90 acres of public lands that are owned by various different entities. And part of that is that there are people living in these landscapes in ways that are quite unsafe. I'll raise one specific example. Along Interstate 90 here, there are people living on this highway verge that, you know, they could fall and land on the highway, break a bone, worse, be hit by a vehicle. It's a pretty tenuous situation. But what if we took the lesson from Walla Walla and used the spatial skills that landscape architects possess and say, what is the right fit of different types of triage housing to this public landscape? What if we saw the public landscape as one of the most effective tools that we can deploy to make people stable and safe? What if we use that public landscape as a form of co-stewardship to help people experiencing homelessness, provide them with this triage housing model, and take care of our public lands in a better way than what's happening right now? And those models in Walla Walla are also played out in other cities across the West Coast. I'll point to a couple of examples here. One is the safe parking lots. There's a huge number of people who are finding themselves living in vehicular housing of one form or the other, whether it's an RV or it's a vehicle like a car or a truck, or the tiny house villages that are here in Seattle or in Austin, Texas. So what if we took those tools, those different typologies, and applied them to different landscapes? For example, the middle school that my son will be going to next year, it has a large unused asphalt parking lot that I don't think I've ever seen more than 2 cars in. Could that be a safe parking lot for the thousands of Seattle school children whose parents are experiencing homelessness? Or could one of the tennis courts that is seldom used become a sanctioned homeless encampment? Or could those Quonset huts be part of a strategy for school children who are in the elementary school? Could these other models be distributed across the landscape in different ways, again, to provide a sense of security and safety? And proportionally, that 90 acres that's here only requires that we would house 10 people. You know, so the proportional representation of the number of people experiencing homelessness in the city of Seattle, this landscape would only require providing housing for 10 of them. Housing one person per 10 acres or one dwelling unit per 10 acre, that's a pretty easy lift in a city as dense as Seattle. But no one has asked the question, no one's framed the challenge in that way. So I want to then talk about another volunteer project that gets to the issue that is an ongoing issue around sanitation, and that's the Seattle Street Sink. This was an issue, sanitation was an issue before COVID, but COVID made it much more important. I want to read something that Gavin Newsom in California said in 2019. He says, "Our homelessness crisis is increasingly becoming a public health crisis." He kind of pauses at that moment and he talks about hepatitis and syphilis, typhus within the state's homeless encampments. And then he says, you know, typhus, a medieval disease in California in 2019. Now that's a public policy choice for that to happen. And I'll tell you how that public policy choice plays out in Seattle. So we had an auditor come through who said that given the number of people who are experiencing homelessness in our state or in our city, we should have 224 restrooms that are publicly available 24 hours a day. Here's how many the auditor fined. He found 6. This was pre-COVID. He found 6 restrooms that people could use 24 hours a day. And I think most communities probably have as paltry a number as that. Yet with COVID, we quickly had 0 restrooms available. Everything kind of locked down, and there was no place for people to wash their hands, no place to use the restroom. And we had a suspicion that because of the vulnerability of the homeless population, they would be more susceptible. And in fact, recent epidemiological data has said that they have a 30% higher mortality rate than the general population if they catch COVID. So a group of designers, including folks at the UW Landscape Architecture and Architecture program, were reached out to by Real Change, which is our street newspaper here that serves the homeless and very low income community. And they said, we need to find a way to make a sink that is easy to deploy, that we can put out now so that people can wash their hands. Remember, all the public health guidance was wash your hands, break down COVID so you can stop transmission. So Tiffany there in the orange jacket reached out to Rick and to Jeff, who pulled me in along with Elizabeth Golden to define a strategy. And so we prototyped this one, which is called the Seattle Street Sink. It's a combination of off-the-shelf materials attached to a rain garden that cleans and treats storm or the gray water coming out of the sink prior to it discharging into the city system. The way that this model works is that we have a host organization, and Jared, who's in the back there leaning it up against that metal container, is our host organization in this case at the young adult shelter. We tie into their hose bib. The hose is the water source, and we keep it filled with soap, but they kind of make sure that the hose isn't kinked or cut or whatever. About $300, $400 in materials to make this, plus some volunteer time. It's up on a website, and you can find the URL there to make your own sink. We wanted it to be very democratic, very distributed in its model. There's a DIY video, there's a parts list where you can go to Lowe's or Home Depot or wherever to make it. And we've also made a model that is, I would say, wheelchair friendly, but not meeting the letter of the law in terms of ADA, but much more friendly than the sort of basin sink there. And as soon as we put it out, this woman came up out of her walker and said, "Is this for us?" Like, she was just blissed out of her mind that someone had thought about the homeless population and was excited to use it. And we've since had it adopted in the Metcalfe Valley. The Sikh temple down in Renton, which is a suburb of Seattle, is adopting it. Duke has made one of these on their campus. And we actually were successful in getting $100,000 through the City of Seattle's budget process. And we're working with the city right now to roll it out to many more locations across the city. So that's been a really exciting volunteer project that we've been engaged in. The last discrete project that I'm going to talk about is taking it back to, okay, these volunteer extracurricular projects, how do they come back to the professional practice? And I firmly believe that our greatest skill as practitioners is not how well we can click CAD or we can assemble a Photoshop collage. It's our capacity for empathy. And I want to talk about that here in Pioneer Square. So this is the site. We're working on 4 streets, including this one. This is Main Street in Pioneer Square. Pioneer Square, for folks who don't know, is a protected historic district, one of the first in the country. All these beautiful Richardsonian Romanesque buildings that were built after the Great Fire in the 1890s are very well protected and stewarded by the city of Seattle. One of the other things that Pioneer Square is it is the original skid road. It is the place where they literally skidded the wood down the hill into the harbor so that it could be brought off to various ports. It was also the spot where poor people came to live. And so the former ED of the Business Improvement Association in the neighborhood said to me once, you know, we live Seattle's values. Much of Seattle is zoned single family, and you don't have to worry about poor people being near you. This community, Pioneer Square, lives Seattle's values because they have somewhere upwards of 2,000 supportive housing beds within the confines of the historic district. So how do we take those people and think about them as an asset in terms of remaking the city? One of the things that we knew that we wanted to do was to expand the conversation about the history of this place. So those buildings are all between 1890 and 1930, and that is protected, and we cannot touch those buildings. Those vertical structures are monuments to that time period. But the horizontal landscape is not as protected. There's room to play there. There's room to intensify and deepen that story and reveal different narratives, including, the history of gay life in Seattle, the history of the fire, the indigenous history, which is really something that we keyed into, because that 40 years obscures some 8,000 years of inhabitation by the Duwamish tribe and the Coast Salish people. So our strategy, our partie is very simple. There's a series of layers beneath the surface that are obscured. We wanted to open up the surface, invite those layers to emerge, and reknit them into the fabric of the city. And one of the most important, one of the ones that's really keen in our thinking is that tribal history, because people were living here for those 8,000 years. And they never gave up their land. They thought that they had signed treaties to be able to occupy it for time, once white settlers came here. But that was quickly proven not to be true. This is an example of the last spot within Seattle where the Native peoples were allowed to live in that early pioneer days, a spot called Ballast Island at the end of Main Street that I showed you an image of earlier. That was the spot where they could pitch a tent and live on the land that had been their home for generations upon generations. So in thinking about how to transform these corridors, one of our thoughts was to reaffirm those indigenous lifeways, to make this a space that wasn't about the past, but was about the fact that those lifeways are still here today in the city, and that these people who have been here for some 8,000 years are still a part of the city, and they have important contributions and stories to tell. And thinking about the plant palette, we're generally erring towards, we probably have about a 90% native plant palette at this point, and it might go 100% by the time we're all said and done. Thinking about how we talk about camas bulbs, for example, on the left there, which are one of the real starch staples of the Native American community, or the overwintering evergreen huckleberry, or rose hips from the Nukta rose, telling that story in this public landscape, which is basically all hardscape right now, invites the opportunity to deepen the narrative and to thicken the storytelling that we have. We also have a nearby human service provider who is specifically targeted to the Native American community. So our ideal and what we're working to put in place is to think about how this public land can again help serve people experiencing homelessness through curatorship, through storytelling, through job training, and again, that model of co-stewardship, not in terms of hosting housing, but of deepening that story and of helping people get to a place where they're back on their feet. So I want to close out the conversation today with something my first boss said, Rich Haig. He said, all landscapes are political. And I think the implication there is that one way or the other, whether we mean to or not, all landscape architects are also political. And it's our decision about how we want to use that political power to affect change. Now, public landscapes have been the place where the story of expanding who we are as an American people have been fought. the rights of Black people, the rights of Native Americans, of women, of people with disabilities, of the LGBTQ community. Those battles have taken place on public ground for the public good. And I believe it's through those trials we've become stronger and more inclusive, more equitable, and more democratic as a country. It's through those public spaces that we've bent the arc of our democracy towards justice. And so we have a choice. We can continue to practice public space as a space of exclusion through those benches and those bolts that we saw early on in the conversation, or we can make them be a place of invitation. And while I wish that we were investing in this way in building public housing, and we ultimately need to be investing this way in public housing, this is a 40-year-long problem that has occurred, and it's going to be probably at least 40 years until we're able to work our way out of it in terms of building enough supportive housing. But in this conversation, I think that often about something else, which is this simple curb ramp. It was 30 years ago in 1990 that we mandated people had to build curb ramps. And still, we have plenty of curb ramp deficiencies in our communities. But the intention was there to say, we need to make our public space equitable for everyone. And there was lots of pushback at the time, but what happened was that people realized that making this simple accommodation for people in wheelchairs benefited everyone. It benefited people pushing strollers, it benefited elderly folks who had mobility issues, it benefited everyone to expand the definition of who the public was and who we had to serve. What I see happening in American public landscapes, in communities that are affected by homelessness, is that we take amenities away, we take benches away, we take restrooms away, we take these things away, and it makes it worse for everyone. I think if we invited people into the process who were experiencing homelessness, if we acknowledge that everyone needs to sleep, everyone needs to use the bathroom, everyone needs a place to sit, and design spaces that accommodated those things in a smart and intelligent and humane way, then we have the opportunity to rebuild public spaces that are for everyone and that really live up to the democratic ideals of our country. The reason why we're having this conversation is because other systems have failed us. And time again in American history, when other systems have failed, public space has been the setting to call us to the better angels of our nature. So while homelessness represents various systemic fails, let's not let public space be one of those spaces of failure. Let's use it as one of our greatest tools to build people up and restore them to better spots in their lives. And with that, I'd love to turn it over for questions and continue the conversation. And there's my information.
Thank you very
Good.
much.
Nathan, am I on?
Yes, you're on, Professor Zhang.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, Brice. That was fantastic and very, very important and very inspiring work that you're doing. And I hope you've inspired some of our younger audience to get engaged with this in their professional careers. I think you've shown them a pathway that they can make important contributions. I had a question about the role of research. You mentioned that you're writing a book. You presented some research on your own early on in your talk about the statistical demographics of the issue. But I can imagine a lot of research opportunities, including for landscape architects at University of Washington. For example, one might be to compile best practices, like the Seattle Sink and the Sleeping Center. Great ideas that, I can imagine if there was a resource for other cities around the country, that a lot of people would be interested in those. And I believe those best practices and those resources, would be important to subject them to a research test. You know, what do the clients of these places think about them? What do the neighbors, when these come into their neighborhood, are there concerns or issues with the neighbors? So I can imagine, you know, an infinite number of research questions, and I think the research is important, and just be interested to hear your thoughts on that, and if you knew of anybody who was doing this type of research, especially from a landscape architecture perspective.
Yeah, there are folks, and I, you know, I'm doing my little bit, but I am not a researcher. I'm a practitioner. So anything that I do is cobbled together at best, I would say. But there are certainly practitioner or academics who are doing some of this work. Many of them bridging that confluence of sort of human services and built environment, architectural academics. There's a gentleman down in University of Oregon who's done some very explicit research around perceptions of encampments and that sort of thing. You also do have great resources out there from various advocacy organizations. The one that I'll point to immediately is from the National Law Center for Homelessness and Poverty, which has a document called Tent City USA. And one of the things that is in that document is best practices for encampments. And it's a really wonderful sort of toolkit to say, okay, are you establishing protocols? Are you establishing a governance model that works? There's lots of models out there. And I think you're right. They're happening at this sort of discrete local level, and the knowledge sharing and the research has not been done where the best practices coming out of those that are peer reviewed are not getting shared more broadly. And so there is certainly a role there to embed oneself in sort of a spatial model. And a lot of times the spatial model is rather ad hoc. It is, okay, we've got this parking lot, how many tents can we fit? Without thinking about how are people actually going to move through that space? What is the creation of a safe space that people can see who is entering and exiting, so that, you know, potential threats are acknowledged and sort of paused at a checkpoint, for example. That's one of the value adds that I think our profession can provide. Yeah, I think that you're right that there's plenty of opportunity for additional research here.
Great. And just one quick follow-up question. What about the professional opportunities for landscape architecture offices? I'm not saying that should be the motivation, and I know that's certainly not your motivation. But I'm wondering if, you know, if you could see going into the future, the unique, you know, the special tool skill set that we have might be helpful for a lot of cities. Like, how do we deal with this, and how do we implement some of these programs to kind of, you know, take some of the best practices and that have, you know, kind of been proven elsewhere, and then, you know, adapt them to the local situation. Do you see professional opportunities in that, which is kind of a nice 180 degrees from the zoning story of, you know, landscape architects helping to promote segregation?
Yeah, you know, 100%. I think that the skill sets that we have in thinking about these very sort of like nuts and bolts issues of where is the septic hookup and where is the flat piece of ground where you can, you know, we're often thinking about it in terms of wheelchair accessibility, that you can put a tent or you can put a bathroom, or even like, you know, one of the issues that I really have a ton of empathy for is around our Justice Center. My wife's a lawyer, she works down there all the time. There's tons of tents down there because it's right on the edge of Pioneer Square. And there's a woman who works with my wife who is in a wheelchair and she cannot get through. So now we have the conflict of these two constitutionally protected issues. One, the civil rights issue of wheelchair mobility, the other, the cruel and unusual punishment coming from the 14th Amendment. How do we resolve those two things? That seems like a fundamentally a spatial question that landscape architects can have a role in resolving. So there are plenty of opportunities. And I think we're in the space right now where cities need us as design professionals to come forward and be advocates and to put our nose under the tent and say, hey, we're seeing this issue. Are you potentially interested in our suite of potential solutions to it? Are you interested in having us help you? And coming at it in that humble way, but also saying, we think we have something of value to provide here. So that's sort of very specifically around managing homelessness. But I think the second piece of my answer is just generally around every time we're designing a park, every time we're designing a street, the ability to talk with every single member of a community and hear their honest concerns and hear how we can better shape a space for them is really one of those foundational tools for landscape architects. And I would encourage next time anyone is faced with a design challenge to go and have that conversation with someone who's there, who maybe looks down on their luck or who might be homeless, so that you can understand what their perspective is. It's a lot of shared humanity amongst people. And people need places to sit. People need a place to wash their hands. People need a place to use the bathroom. But there's also some particular things that people need. Oftentimes people who are living outdoors have been traumatized many, many times. And the sense of a defensible space where they can watch, prospect and refuge, they can look out over a space and see who's coming for them, but at the same time feel that what's at their back is safe. That's a real need for folks, and doing that in a way that makes sense within a spatial composition is something that landscape architects have unique expertise in.
Very good, thank you.
We do have about 3 questions from the audience. We have one from Hannah, Mark, and Joseph. I think I can unmute Hannah first because she asked the question first. So you can unmute yourself, Hannah.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I was just kind of curious. I don't know. I feel like a lot of the things you address seem kind of like, oh, like these are great things. Like, but why aren't more places kind of making similar projects? And like, I guess, how do you get more people to care about them?
It was funny. I had a conversation about this with someone last week, and at the time I was feeling a little down. Like, why aren't more people caring about this? Yeah, it's a great question. They reminded me that change happens slowly, and the example of the curb ramp, you could look at that as a pessimistic story, but you could also look at it as a deeply optimistic story. And we used to have all these signs of exclusion, in public space, and we slowly changed that. It takes time to do it. What I've been really buoyed by since I've been doing this research and doing talks like this is how much it resonates, particularly among students who are going through programs and are asking these questions and are really deeply engaged with them. I have various students that I'm working with across the country who are interested in this for thesis topics and who want to explore different facets of homelessness. I feel like this is one of those generational things like sustainability. Someone coming out of school in 1990 probably didn't have sustainability on the tip of their tongue and weren't having that conversation foregrounded in every single project. I feel like issues of equity, issues of poverty, issues of homelessness, those things are going to be front and center of every student coming out of any landscape architecture program very quickly here, if they are not already. So I think, Hannah, you're going to see that landscape change rapidly within the next decade, is my hope. That's my optimistic answer.
Thank you.
And then we have a question from Professor Mark Cannon, and you can unmute since you're a co-host.
I think he had to jump off.
Yeah, we saw a chat that he had to leave.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. We have a question from Joseph. If he wants to. Yeah, I asked you. Yeah, there you go, Joseph.
Hi. So the question I had was really about the systems that are in place in East Coast cities right now. How do those differ from West Coast cities? And are those systems that are on the East Coast things that could work in Western cities, or is there a need for a different system?
It's a great question. And I'll have to admit a little bit of naivete around the East Coast cities. I'm originally from Maryland, but I haven't kept up on my East Coast knowledge as well as I should have. But one of the things I understand is two things. Much older cities, so you have a deeper well of housing stock versus a lot of West Coast cities really boomed kind of post-war. And so the housing stock is newer. You don't have sort of those old tenement style dwellings that many older US cities did, where they built housing for poor folks, were primarily built out for middle class and people who can get in the car and drive long distances over here on the West Coast. The other issue that many East Coast cities have is a right to housing. They have right to housing legislation, which says that if you find yourself in poverty in our communities, we as a city are going to find a spot for you to live. And we have very few instances of that type of legislation here on the West Coast. And one of the big problems. I think the other thing that is happening on the West Coast, and that initial lack of deep housing stock is exacerbated by this, which is that we are boom towns right now. We are economic boom towns right now, and we're seeing a ton of growth. We have more people moving into Seattle, for example, than there are housing starts. And so a local think tank calls it a cruel game of musical chairs. So when we don't have enough housing, the price keeps on going up, and whoever can afford it, that same unit that 10 years ago would have been $1,000 a month in rent, now is $2,000 in rent, because we have software engineers who can afford that price point. So where does that $1,000 a month person go? They probably move out of the city, or eventually they become homeless. So those are some of the dynamics at play in the differences between East and West Coast.
Right. Thank you.
And we have Graham Goldich just raised his hand or his or her hand. Can I unmute?
Hi, thank you for this lecture. I was curious, it seems to me that a lot of the amenities that provide the best support are high water use amenities, hand washing, showering, laundry, these things that I'm curious if you're familiar with any projects that utilize this high water use and these high nitrogen and phosphorus gray water loads to produce food in any way. Because that's just my deepest interest to see how these systems can be linked.
That's a really great question. Nothing jumps to mind, but going back to Jack's original question, it's a great research project. You're exactly right that a lot of these things are really basic access to water issues. And I would actually look to sort of the developing world for great models on that. I'm sure they're out there. I just don't have any at the tip of my tongue where, and I've actually helped build one in India, where you're using every available water stream, whether it's gray water, black water, wastewater, what have you, to do something productive because it's such a valuable resource. So arid regions of the world that are doing some really interesting things like that. I think there's fertile ground there for you to find something.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
We have I'm wondering, there's a question from, there's a question from Frank, Professor Frank.
Yeah, Brice, terrific talk. And just that little note here, like, I think you want to make sure, like, that, and I think you talk about this, like, the raising of awareness is like the first step, and then it has to be systematic. I mean, it's not like, I don't want students to get confused that, okay, we're doing all these water things, you know, these things, and then the problem is solved. I think it has to go further. It has to go really, okay, this just like gives us like a tangible thing to think further and to think politically about these things. And could you expand on that? Maybe, because I always think sometimes we think, oh yeah, just we do things and then the problem is solved, you know. So maybe you can expand on this for students.
Yeah, I think that is a great insight, and it was actually a trap that I fell into at the start of the Landscape Architecture Foundation Fellowship. Was I was ready and gung-ho to go in there and design the best bench for homeless people that had ever been designed. You know, Cindy from Olin and you know, Laura from MVVA were like, whoa, chill out, buddy. That's not what we need. What we need is to be humble and ground ourselves and understand what the actual issues are, and be able to do one of the things that landscape architects are really good at, which is telling the story of how a landscape affects people and how people affect the landscape. And, you know, being able to talk to people who are parks advocates, for example, about why they should care about homelessness and human services is a really valuable skill. Because saying, hey, let's just lock everyone up, or let's get the police here, it doesn't solve anything. In fact, it actually makes the problem worse, because people who have a criminal record can't get out of homelessness. It's another barrier that you're putting up for them. So being able to be sophisticated in our understanding and have a conversation and tell empowering stories, tell stories that are not just about the sink, but about how the sink creates a virtuous cycle for public space and for the entire society. That sort of consciousness raising and shifting of the narrative is a really important piece of this. And it's brick by brick, it's piece by piece. It's not transformational wholesale at one time. But the more we have people out there doing that and telling a better story, telling a different story than what we've been doing for the past 40 years, I think it's ultimately going to lead to some pretty powerful change.
Thank you.
Hey. There's a question from Mark who left, and I also have a question. I don't know what the time is looking like, but I can start with Mark's question if you have time.
Sure.
Yeah, so Mark Hammond's question was, is there opportunity for homeless people to engage in co-creation of these spaces rather than just having design interventions on their behalf?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And there's a number of homeless advocates who are very keen on that, who, you know, you have to meet people where they are. And there's a number of people who have experienced homelessness who found the entire shelter system to be deeply patronizing and disempowering, and who want control over their spatial arrangement and want to help make a space and make a community. So there's absolutely a role for co-creation in that. And it's inviting people into charrettes, it's inviting people into, you know, giving public feedback. Yes, 100%.
Thank you. And may I ask a question myself? I know I'm normally the assistant, but
I will let you do it.
Yeah. You know, I mean, this goes beyond landscape architecture, I think, but you know, there's there are these two elephants in the room from my observation. One is in most of our society, land and housing is a very expensive commodity that you cannot acquire unless you have sufficient wealth and income. And secondly, kind of related to that, economic opportunity is not something we can just create, like grow like plants anywhere. A lot of people are really place dependent on economic opportunities. So, do you see a role for landscape architects and planners, other people in the design field, to have some power in changing these dynamics, or are these pretty fundamental?
I'm going to respond to the second piece first, which is that landscape architects, I think, are really good at working in teams and stepping back when we need to, but also leaning in when we need to. And we have relationships with probably every sector of the economy, within our disciplines. We talk to bankers, we talk to finance people, we talk to real estate developers, and building those relationships that we need to do anyways for our business development and inviting them into a problem-solving conversation around homelessness, I bet is something that they'd be pretty excited about. Your first point around land and economics is a really great one, and it's actually one of the reasons why I'm not going to say where I am on the political spectrum, but I will say that one of the challenges I see is it does not feel to me like the market economy is providing adequate housing starts for low-income folks, and that public landscape, which is already held in the public trust, whether it doesn't need to be a park, it can be just excess public land, is a really powerful free opportunity to lower the cost of housing, and to get us building more units of housing more quickly. I think one of the challenges to that is that often our communities are have a limited capacity in terms of their zoning envelopes, but that's changing across the U.S. Just this week. I think Berkeley went to triplexes throughout the city. Other communities are raising those limits and realizing that they're seeing this feedback loop that is pretty dangerous in terms of housing affordability. But you're right, like one of the underlying wealth mechanisms for middle class folks is their home, and there's a fundamental conflict there between housing, which people view as a right, and housing as an investment, and it's hard to reconcile the two. And it might be that there needs to be a bifurcation into two different markets for two different populations. One is the right, and then the other one is the as an investment, and those two things can kind of move in parallel. But that's sort of what I'm seeing today. But you're right, that tension is absolutely there.
Thank you very much. And we have a question from Professor Robert Ryan, and you're a co-host, so you can just unmute.
And before Robert starts, Nathan, I'll say that was a good question. They should let you ask other questions in the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You can always ask questions, Nathan. Brice, thank you for the wonderful talk. I think you sort of answered part of my question. This was really like the role of advocacy for landscape architects. Homelessness is one issue, affordable housing relates to that. So how do you see your own role, maybe personally, but also how do we as a larger profession advocate for affordable housing?
Yeah, I think that it would serve the profession very well for all of us to be organizers at some point in our lives. Because the tools that you learn as an advocate in motivating other people is exactly the tools that we use to convince a client to move in a particular direction. There's a guy named Marshall Gans out of Harvard who wrote the playbook for the Obama campaign. And one of his fundamental ideas is that the way that you make change happen is through the story of you, the story of me, and the story of now. And so if I can understand what your motivation is, and you can understand what my motivation is, and we can understand that together now is the time to make change, I think we can come to a good place. So one of the places where I run into tensions in the local community, who I have tons of friends in the park advocacy and park staff world, is there's a real tension there in terms of park staff who did not sign up for this.
Mm-hmm.
This is not what they came to do. And they're frustrated, they're upset, they don't want to be cleaning up human feces out of natural areas, you know, to put it really simply and kind of gross. So let's come together and acknowledge that concern, figure out that what we're doing right now is only going to lead to more of that, and then come together to find a better solution. And I think that that type of conversation and creating the space for that conversation is one of the really good things that we do. And then because we're always both optimistic and pragmatic by disposition, I think many times, we can start pulling out that piece of trace or start scribbling on the whiteboard and say, well, what about this? What if we tried this model? What if we did this other thing here? Not just fester in the frustrations, but really use it as a jumping off point for an optimistic future.
Great, thanks.
Brice, I have another question. Maybe not completely related. I mean, you work in an area that is economically doing well, and all these typical East and West Coast cities are. We here work also sometimes with cities that are kind of former industrial cities, cities that are having a hard time economically. Housing prices are not high. Some cities like Springfield have a record that people would make money out of public housing. And still the problem of homelessness exists. So on the other, so you have like a city who wants to get out of poverty. It's not like a hub like Seattle, San Francisco, and I've seen that there in public space too. Like one of the Court Square for 10 years never had benches. You know, I was getting always angry about it. You know, now they have benches, and of course, I mean, they're populated by a mix of people. But what is a message maybe for these cities? Because they're not the only ones that exist. But there are a couple of cities that are not doing well.
Yeah, no, I think that they're probably facing many of the same concerns that a city like Walla Walla was, where there's a real fear that sort of the perception becomes reality, right? That when you drive through that town and you're seeing visible homelessness, that the mental geography of that place is, oh, that's a place with a lot of homelessness, or that's a place that is depressed, and it doesn't attract investment. It makes it feel like an unsafe place to many people. I think that using this notion of finding a space within the city that makes sense to stabilize people, to provide a sense of safety and security, and that makes everyone feel like they are cared for in the community is a real opportunity in terms of rebuilding that sense that, you know, we are a community. We are a place that looks out for one another. And I think there's so many forces at play in our society right now that are pulling us apart. And at that hyper local level, and I don't know the communities that you're talking about, but like my sense is that, like, you know, it's like a little bit of like Mayberry, but seen better times. You know, that where everyone kind of knows each other and knows where people are coming from. If we're not able to work together and find a solution that's outside of the box and that's better for everyone at that scale, we got bigger problems. And I think that those are the opportunities where you can really find some space to move if you get the right people in the room and problem-solving mentality.
Thank you. Yeah.
Good. I think we've addressed all the questions. Is that right, Nathan?
Yeah, there was a quick note, thank you note from Joseph. You know, he was saying it was good, and he was saying he would like to see some more interaction between people who are working and who can see the need for public infrastructure. He was working in landscaping and noticed a lot of value of public infrastructure. That was it. Yeah, and I think there are no more questions.
Very good. Well, thank you, Brice. It was everything I expected and more. Your work is really inspiring and really important, and I wish you success with your book, and I look forward to reading it, and hopefully to see you at a conference in the near future when we can go back to doing things like that.
It'll be an amazing day. And again, thank you everyone within the University of Massachusetts community. It was really a pleasure. And thanks for the great conversation this afternoon.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you very much.
Looking forward.
Bye, everyone.